What about then baptism and children? I have no idea how many of you in this room are paedo-Baptists and how many are not. I suspect the majority of you probably are in churches where they baptize children, as of course I am. But I suspect that, like many people in my church, a lot of you may have questions about that, which are absolutely fair enough, questions we have to ask. One of the most moving moments of my ministry in recent years was baptizing my own grandson, Joseph, to whom this book is partly dedicated. It was just over a year ago he was baptized when he was a few months old, and it was a wonderful moment. I'll just share the anecdote with you because I had never expected to have a 4-generational baptism. But my father was there and read the first reading, and my son, the baby's father, read the second reading, and I, the grandfather, baptized the baby. And that was just an extraordinary moment where a sense of the faithfulness of God from generation to generation and the making of that physical in baptism was very, very powerful. We sang that hymn, Now Thank We All Our God, and we got to the line, Who from our mother's arms has blessed us on our way. And I looked across the chapel and I saw my mother and my wife and my daughter-in-law, and I couldn't sing the next line. It was a very powerful moment, and that's what the sacraments do. But when people say to me, how can you baptize a child because this child can't believe yet, I have a puzzle about that. And again, I'm winging this. I don't have an explicitly argued out theology of this, but I share it with you and invite your comments and your comeback. I have a cousin in Vancouver who got married a long time after me, though he's about the same age as me. And so by the time he and his wife were having their first child, our children were already nearly teenagers. And they sat me down over dinner one evening just before their child was born, and they said, we've got a question for you. And they're a bit shy about it because they weren't explicit, deeply professing Christians, but they wanted to kind of find their way in. They said, we want to know, how old does a child have to be before the child can actually know anything about God? And I think they were expecting me to say about 6 or 8 or 10 or something like that. I said about 3 minutes. And they stared at me. And I said, well, you'll find, if the child is born even reasonably healthy, that you will be able to establish a very intimate relationship with that child from those very, very early moments. The natural focal point of a newborn child's eyes are the distance between the breast and the mother's eyes. So that the natural thing that the child does is to establish eye contact with mum while feeding at the breast. And I remember establishing eye contact with my children very, very early on in their first minutes. And there's this extraordinary sense of knowing, of a question in knowing, but a knowing which passes between parent and child. And I say to myself, and I said to my cousin, if that is so between the human parent and the child, are you really going to tell me that the living God who created heaven and earth and made whales and waterfalls and little penguins and all the rest of it cannot establish contact with a lovely little creature who bears his image, but has to wait until that lovely little creature becomes 5 or 6 or 7 or 10? Forget it. God has ways of making himself known intimately to children from their earliest days. And perhaps one of the, dare I say, sacramental ways by which God does that is precisely by the loving welcome of the Christian community. Now, of course, children can't articulate it. The 5-minute-old baby can't put her hand up and say, okay, I believe in the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. But I actually suspect, I'm being very serious here, I suspect that some of those little children, to the God who knows the hearts of all, have a deeper and fuller faith than a lot of people who say those words every Sunday but have long since allowed them to drift off into the distance somewhere. I once was doing a children's talk at a baptism, and I got some kids around and I got them to blow up some balloons. And the balloons were all basically the same type of balloon, but the first child, I just let him do 2 or 3 little puffs into the balloon, and I said, okay, hold it right there. We held the balloon there, and then the other child went on puffing and puffing and puffing and blew up this enormous balloon. And then I held them up and I asked the children, which of these balloons is more full? And of course they all said the big one. And I said, are you sure? They're scratching their heads. Actually, no, both these balloons are full. The one has got more air in because it's just become a bigger balloon. What would happen if you had that amount of air in that size balloon? Well, there'd be a vacuum, it would collapse back or whatever. A very little person can be totally full of the love of God, even though, of course, when they grow up and become a bigger person, they need to be filled with more of the love of God. But that little person is not necessarily only half full just because they're a little person. Now, this is not a great, well-argued theological justification of infant baptism. It's a way of saying that I suspect that some of our Western cultural prejudices are what's at stake here. And that when we actually start to think about what we're talking about. Another thing, one of the churches in my diocese has a wonderful ministry with families who have children with Down syndrome. And it's one of the really moving things to see these young people, and actually some of them not so young with Down syndrome, coming to the altar to receive communion. And there were originally some people in that church who said, well, they've got Down syndrome, they can't understand, they can't be educated, they can't go to confirmation classes. Those people know about the love of God and are responding to the love of God in wonderful and moving ways. And to give communion to those people with Down syndrome, I find deeply moving and deeply grace-filled. And I'm a theologian. I'm all for people learning and articulating their faith as richly and as fully as they can. But part of that faith has to be the welcome for the little people, the damaged people, the people we call damaged. We're all damaged, God knows.